Welcome to the 3-Year-Old Parenting Podcast, where we have conversations about parenting with grace and how to better disciple our own children. I am Pastor Melissa. I'm the lead pastor at First United Methodist Church of Cleburne, and I am the mom to a toddler, single mom.
There you go. My name is Reverend Bill, and I do family ministries here at the church, and I have children. Yeah. I have high school children.
I'm Kevin Anderson. I'm the pastor of community here, and I have two children, one in high school, one in junior high, and Jesus has joined us for today's conversation.
That's right, for the final episode of
Jesus
season 1.
Jesus has been with us the whole way. You just didn't
see that Jesus is with us.
Right now, Jesus is kind of crowding my personal space.
Jesus has joined us in plush form.
That's right. Yes. And so episode 10, Along Comes Grace. But really that is how we wanted to end this season 1 of the 3-Year-Old Parenting Podcast. We've followed along with John Wesley's 3 general rules: do no harm, do good, keep the ordinances of God, or as we like to say, stay in love with God. And with that, there's this great thing, Bill, you were the one who introduced it to me, of this idea that as a parent, it really doesn't matter what parenting style you take on.
Yeah, I saw this in a documentary called Freakonomics. Some people have read the book, or there's different things of this, but I loved one of the things that they had in the documentary. It talked about, they began looking at what parenting philosophy was the most effective, and what they basically came to realize is it didn't matter what your philosophy was. It mattered that you cared enough as a parent to research or find a philosophy, and that caring was enough. But what became the thing was not what philosophy you chose, it's that you were a parent that cared enough to have a philosophy, and that if you did that, if you were a parent who cared enough to do that kind of work, you typically were a pretty solid parent. And so kind of as a word of grace to you, if you've listened to 10 weeks of this trying to become a better parent, well, then hear this word of grace. You're probably a pretty good parent.
Absolutely.
The fact that you've chosen to give the time and effort to follow along in this journey with us means you're probably a pretty good parent.
Absolutely. And like with that, so like around this table we have like varying experiences and levels and loves of the various like Enneagram and like Myers-Briggs, Strength Finders, Berkman assessment, on and on and on, all these kinds of like personality assessments, this kind of thing. And I'm a real big nerd when it comes to a lot of those kinds of things. I know, surprise.
I found that out very quickly.
Yeah, very quickly. And so for me, one of the things that I love, the more that I know about various ones, is how they like to play together. And so I would say, take what you've learned over the course of these 10 episodes of what of the 3-year-old parenting plays well with, are you in that realm of gentle parenting, or are you in a old school parenting, or are you in, name, fill in the blank, take what works, leave what doesn't. And I think what I love about this one that comes alongside of what I would call Enneagram work so well is that Enneagram looks at your internal motivations, right? And I think 3-year-old parenting comes along and really looks at where are we with God in the midst of this, right? Where are our kids and their discipleship, and where are we as parents as well, right? In our discipleship walk, taking honest looks at that. And then we can bring along these other techniques, parenting skills that we pick up along the way, and we can bring both of these into communication and conversation with each other. I don't know if y'all have kind of seen that play out, even in the short time we've been engaging with kind of creating this idea of 3-year-old parenting as we've gone.
No.
Well, then
I haven't thought about it that much, I guess, and maybe from a more practical perspective. But what I've appreciated, but just looking at all this and speaking to all the parents, is we're talking about grace today, and at least for me personally, the hardest person to give grace to is myself. That I'm self-reflective, more so self-critical sometimes, where I'm like, did I do that right? Could have I handled that better? And that's not just in parenting, that's in a lot of things that I do. But know as a parent that you're going to make mistakes. You're not going to be perfect, and that's okay. Give yourself some grace in all of this. That, you know, your kids they're great. They understand. They're going to make mistakes. Right. We're going to make mistakes as parents, but we learn from them. We continue to grow, and when those mistakes are made, show yourself grace. Show your kids grace when they make a mistake. Yeah. And just continue to grow together in relationship with your children, with your spouse, with those who are around you. You know, everybody has this circle of people who are, you know, maybe it's grandparents, aunts, uncles who can help with, because it really does take a village to help raise our kids. And so just give yourself some grace in all of this.
Well, you mentioned Enneagram, so one of the things I think is helpful from Enneagram work is the idea of the wounding message, that all children get a wounding message. But one of the things that I've heard Enneagram teachers talk about is it doesn't matter how good you are as a parent. Your child will pick up some wounding message. Yeah. Even if you were the most amazing parent of all time, they'll still pick up a wounding message. And so it's kind of that thing of, you just do your best. Again, that's where I've laughed through this conversation. We've talked about, you know, Wesley said, do no harm. And we're like, well, let's try to do less harm. Yeah, I always laugh at that just with John Wesley in general. You know, Wesley talked about do all the good you can and all the places you can, all the ways you can.
For as long as you can.
And you're like, whoo, that sounds like a lot. And I came across a quote from Teddy Roosevelt that was a lot simpler. And it was like, do the best you can where you are, what you have. And I'm like, that's a little closer, man.
That's a little simpler.
I mean, you're like, well, I mean,
John, I only have to remember three things on that one.
I mean, in all fairness,
okay, but
John was a pastor. He's going to take every word you give him.
I'm like, John's expectation a little high. And I'm like, okay, let's strive for that. That's it, striving for perfection. But you will also need to just, I think sometimes here, okay, today's going to be a Teddy day. I'm going to do the best I can with where I am with what I have.
I love that.
And again, give yourself that grace that you're doing the best you can with what you have, where you are. And our hope in this is just to be able to add to that and not to shame or make you feel bad, but to say, okay, you're doing the best you can, but can we add something to that, to your awareness, to your understanding, to your resources? To just say, okay, maybe I can do a little better. I'm doing the best I can with what I have. And so we're wanting to add to that what you have a little bit to help you do a little better. And so I do encourage you, check out some of the things we've thrown out a couple of different ideas and resources, but it's worth doing a little your own Google. If you're one of our church people, you know, follow up and talk with us. Family systems is something to check out and just do a little Googling on. I think it's a helpful thing to be aware of and to think about. I'm a big fan of resources like Love and Logic I've mentioned, especially when it comes to doing discipline in a way that doesn't become a negative and do harm. The 40 Developmental Assets by the Search Institute is a way to kind of look at how do I do better. Enneagram, I think, can be helpful, especially on the spiritual piece of my motivation and what kind of, and so there's a lot of wonderful resources that we've mentioned throughout doing this that it's worth doing your own kind of Googling, and if not, if you're one of the people that actually knows us personally, talk to us about those things.
And if there's something that you want us to link resources to, you know, drop a comment where you watched this podcast at, and we'll happily reply and respond and kind of link you, give you a sense of where we like to hit up on the internet for these resources. And also with that, you know, in future seasons, we'll kind of dive further into, you know, the Wesleyan forms of grace. But, you know, remember that just like we kind of had this larger discussion of there's all these forms of sin, there's also grace takes on so many forms. And we as parents also get to, you know, we get to reflect God to our kids at times, which is this big and sometimes overwhelming responsibility, but other times it's kind of this cool thing that we get to remember of like, ooh, we get to do this. It's joyful, I think. And so remember that you get to be prevenient grace to your kids, right? Before your kids know to pursue God or know that there's something worth, you know, chasing after, you can give them hints. You can show them that there's something worth being modeled after.
I had a wonderful story for this years ago. I had a young lady that was in my youth program and became friends with her as she grew up into an adult. And several years ago, she actually passed away, and I was able to speak at her funeral. But one of the stories I got to tell was when she was having her second child, she had her first son. Her first child was a boy named Jack, and she was getting maternity clothes from my wife, Branda, because she was getting ready. But for her first son, but it was interesting. She was talking about both of her kids that she was wanting to have, and she had even talked about her daughter's name, what she was going to name her daughter before she was ever born. When she was on kid number one, she was already talking about how much she loved and was excited for kid number two. And I got to talk about that at the funeral. I was like, your mother named you and knew you and loved you years before you came to be. And what an expression of prevenient grace for us to understand that that's how God loved us. Is God has loved us before we even existed.
Absolutely.
God's naming us and claiming us and loving us. And so, like I said, I think about that when I think about prevenient grace. Is she's on kid number one, but she's already talking about how excited she is for kid number two.
That's beautiful.
And all those plans and love.
Yeah, and if we're taking the idea of grace a step further, I think we have an understanding. Well, we filled out ordination paperwork, so we should have a good understanding of grace. But for us to model that in ways for our kids, regardless of their age, I mean, it's going to be different for Bill and I with older kids than you with Ellis. But so, for instance, we can talk about grace from from an academic perspective, whereas you just probably more so show her grace. And so I think regardless of where your kids are, you can show them grace. You can, when they're ready, you can talk to them about grace, but the understanding that God gave us that grace so that we could share it. I mean, God gave us grace so that we could share it with our kids and with everybody that we meet. But we got to accept it. We have to accept it. That it's like, okay, I messed up. I almost hit my daughter in the head with a frying pan last night on accident. But I was no.
I don't know. That sounds like People's Exhibit A. I don't know that I'd say that, Kev.
I was doing the dishes, and it was off the drying rack, so I flung it up to miss it over to where I didn't hit the crock pot, and didn't realize that she was coming in the kitchen behind me, and she goes back. I was like, whoa, that would have been a really bad. But that we have to accept the grace, even though we're not, and it's hard to accept, we're not worthy of God's grace all the time. There are times that we mess up. And guess what? God doesn't love us any less. And as parents, when my kids mess up, I don't love them any less. I might shake my head at them and say, why did you do that? But it doesn't mean I love them any less.
And that's that justifying grace piece, right? That's that forgiveness, that's meeting them where they are. And I think that brings us into this
continual learning about what it is.
Kind of this last piece of grace that I want to speak about this morning with us is kind of what we could roll into sanctifying grace, which is this process of becoming holier, which I think, we can use our Wesleyan roots, but then we can also have this great discussion about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and get into this idea of costly grace versus cheap grace. Because I think sometimes we resist the idea of grace because we think it's something cheap. That we think it's something that it's like, well, we don't need to receive it, or
it's not.
We brush.
Important.
Yeah, exactly. It's not that important. Or we diminish its value because we think it's. I think of authoritative parenting versus permissive parenting, and I've seen that a lot of discussions in the gentle parenting world on that, of like, when people tend to not like gentle parenting, it's because they've seen people do it as permissive parenting, and that would be in the cheap grace realm, right? Of like, it's really the kid just getting whatever they want whenever they want, versus costly grace is actually authoritative parenting. It's still setting discipline and boundaries, and it's helping your kid grow, but also understanding when you meet them with that love.
So if you haven't read Bonhoeffer, because maybe you haven't, Bonhoeffer talks
about... wait. You mean people sitting at this table probably haven't read Bonhoeffer?
If you haven't read Bonhoeffer, He talks about cheap grace and costly grace, and he talks about, well, grace is given freely, it shouldn't be treated as cheap. And cheap is kind of when we want just the positive without. I always kind of talk about it. One of our previous conversations, it's wanting the freedom without the responsibility. Yeah. And when we think that's how it is, and we do that, that's kind of that cheap grace. So it's, forgiveness without confession, without having to own that I've made a mistake and I regret that and I want to do better, and just saying, oh, you're forgiven, it's okay, I wash over. No, there needs to be accountability. Yeah. There's forgiveness, right, but there has to be holding accountable, and that you have to have these things in balance and intention. Yeah. And that is the difference between cheap grace is just expecting that, well, you should forgive me even though I keep hurting you. Mm-hmm. Again, taking abuse and just, well, that's cheap grace, expecting that. And then costly grace is free. Again, forgiveness is always offered, but it comes with a responsibility to then, live in a certain way. Bonhoeffer talked about, having baptism with no church discipline then, that right, to baptize you and then say, okay, you're in, and now what, we're just done? No, you continue to do the sanctifying grace and work and grow. And so that's one of those things where I think it's really unhelpful when we have this idea of this cheap grace, right, and in both our parenting but also in our spiritual life, when we think it's just this thing of like, oh, I can just say the words and write the line and I'm done. And you're like, no, this is, again, it's one of the things where I think we're trying to get to in both the conversations about discipleship and parenting. It's about doing it every day, doing the work every day to get a little bit better every day, to get a little bit closer to Christ in your walk with Christ, in your discipleship every day. That's what costly grace is to try to grow and change and become more every day. Yep. But then hopefully doing that as parents is too. Again, accepting we'll make stumbles and failures and falls, but we're going to try to work on it and get a little better every day. Yeah.
Something I love in the Methodist tradition is that anytime a new member joins the church, we then turn around and ask the entire church to also reaffirm that you're going to continue, right? It's this reminder that, like, sometimes, like, I almost wish we had this longer liturgy to what we're committing to, because we pack so much in one line, right? Like, will you support insert name of your church, right? With your prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness. That is a lot that we're asking someone to do. And because we say it so quick, it can feel like this, like, yeah. Like, it can feel like cheap grace, right? Like, yes, amen, right? Yeah.
We're going through the motions. We know what this says.
But when you think about what each of those is asking you to do and your willingness to commit, right, to each of those things, right? And you could think about that, applying that within our parenting lens of not just, church membership, but what are we doing to pray for our kids? What are we doing to show up with our presence and our gifts for our kids? What are we doing to show up with our witness for our kids?
Well, that was the question we'd asked the other day. Could your kids tell you a story about where they've seen, you being Christ-like? Right. Have you lived that witness out?
Absolutely.
Even in front of your own children. And so these are kind of, like I said, when we started talking about all this, parenting and discipleship, I just think so much of it is interwoven that when you understand how to start trying to become a deeper disciple, it also leads you into becoming a stronger, healthier parent.
Yes.
I think the two go together really well.
Yeah.
I love that.
Well, Melissa stole what I was going to say when you were talking. But you mentioned baptism, and so we had a baptism a few weeks ago, and not just in church membership, but as when children or adults are baptized, they're asked questions if they can answer for themselves. When my kids were baptized, they were infants, so we answered the question that we are going to raise them up in the church. We are going to raise them up to be. So we commit to that, and then they go through confirmation, and then they get to make that decision for themselves. But every time there's baptism or confirmation or somebody joins the church, it's a community. So it's not just like, okay, you're baptized. It's like, no, talk to the church and say, will you recommit, not just recommit, yourself to upholding this by prayers, presence, gift, service, and witness, but will you help raise up the person that has just joined? Will you
Bill
raise up the
person
down
the aisle.
who's baptized?
Yeah.
You know, so it's everybody does it, but we recommit that we're going to help as church members. We're going to help raise that child or help raise that adult, you know, in discipleship. And so I just think that's really cool. You know, when somebody wants to be baptized, like, well, let's do it with the church. That's the community.
That's why we don't do private baptisms in the Methodist Church. Not to say that we haven't done, you know, we've gone out to special locations for people if there's a place that'd be really meaningful, but there has to be a representative body of the church community. And because we believe grace is experienced, not in a cheap form, but in costly community.
Well, and in all this, so this is why we have Plush Jesus with us today, is I think we come back to, so boil it down, what's a simple thing? Well, and the simple thing is we'll come back to Jesus again. We had a previously pastor that was kind of his favorite tagline, was just simply Jesus. Everything came back to Jesus.
It's right here on the wristband.
Everything came back to Jesus. And I think that, again, in our discipleship, but even our parenting, you know, if you don't know what you're doing, just stop and go, okay, again, it's that old question about what would Jesus do? It's this, you know, Jesus was the living embodiment and fullest expression of God's grace, made flesh, made human, incarnate. And so when you don't know, just go, well, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus say? Does Jesus have, you know, when you're struggling with something as a parent, stop and ask yourself, is there any story I can think about where Jesus is dealing with anything like this? And then say, well, what would that be? If Jesus was sitting next to me in the chair, what advice do I think Jesus would give me in this moment? Again, if you just take a little bit of time and slow down and meditate on and think about, what would Jesus say? What would Jesus encourage me to do? What advice would Jesus give? What advice can I find in the scriptures? I think you're going to find your parenting is going to look a little bit different. I think you're also going to find that you're just going to feel that you're in a different place in your own walk with Christ. Because again, you're spending all that time with Jesus now. In your head, in your imagination, in your spirit, in reading scripture, whatever that is, that's going to bring you closer. And so again, it becomes this kind of cyclical thing that the deeper discipleship, I think, will strengthen your parenting. But if you try to parent in this kind of model that we're talking about, this, you know, Jesus-focused model, it's going to just bring you back into deeper discipleship.
Again and again. So here is our final challenge for season 1 of the 3-Year-Old Parenting Podcast. Would you take some time as a parent to have a conversation with Jesus this week? And now would you receive this benediction, a blessing that's meant to be lived out as you go about your week? Would you go seeking to do no harm, seeking to do good, and seeking to stay in love with God? And we'll see you next season on the 3-Year-Old Parenting Podcast. We ready?
What are we doing?
Grace.
Grace.
And
something about grace.
That's right. Y'all get no notes on this one.
I was going to say, no
It was
notes.
intentional. Ready? Here we go.